as part of my labors to try to understand Jung's take on Christianity, I found the introduction to this text, Jung on Christianity, compiled by Murray Stein, to be helpful, very helpful. Murray Stein has some stuff available online on YouTube and elsewhere. And Murray Stein, PhD, is the author of Jung's treatment of Christianity, Practicing Wholeness, Transformation, Emergence of the Self, and Jung's Map of the Soul. He's an international lecturer and teacher, currently vice president of the International Association for Analytical Psychology. He's also a training analyst at the C.G. Jung Institute of Chicago. And I found his thoughts on the topic of evil to be extremely clarifying. And so I thought I would make space in this playlist for his introduction to Jung's work. That's what I'm going to be talking about. And so without, I guess, more or less further ado, the introduction begins with a quote from Jung which says, "The arcane substance of alchemy corresponds to the Christian dominant, which was originally alive and present in consciousness, but then sank into the unconscious and must now be restored in renewed form." And Stein says, "In the passage quoted above, taken from the late work Mysterium Coniunctionis, Jung speaks as a religious man, a homo religiosus, and also as one for whom the central images of Christianity are a psychic reality that carries significant meaning. Often he writes about Christian themes in this way. He cares deeply about their value and importance, and he even proposes several important theological and practical revisions for Christianity. He speaks, however, as a psychologist and not as a Christian theologian or believer. This combination of factors, which characterizes Jung's approach to Christianity, has led to several general misunderstandings. One major misinterpretation is that Jung was a Christian apologist, i.e., a defender of Christian truths within a contemporary setting using modern concepts and language. By some, he's even been looked upon as a possible savior of Christianity in a time when its spiritual message is going unheard for want of persuasive images and concepts. His writings are taken at times as the words of a modern prophet. He is seen as a kind of evangelist in the garb of a medical psychologist. Clearly, this kind of evangelical persuasion was not Jung's intention, even if some of his writings give this impression. When he states, as above, that the Christian message, quote, must now be restored in renewed form, one might imagine him speaking in the voice of the Protestant Reformation. But given Jung's overall perspective and psychological program, this is a misreading. Unlike his Swiss countrymen, Karl Barth and Emil Brunner, two Protestant contemporaries who did consider the revitalization of Christian theology to be their mission, Jung does not place himself within the Christian theological circle. This would be presumptuous. He was trained as a medical doctor, not as a theologian. He was not out to serve the church, nor, like Paul Tillich, to correlate Christian answers to modern culture's questions. It is true that he expresses grave concern about a perceived lack of vitality in contemporary Christianity, but his focus lies not so much on the church as on modern people who are spiritually adrift and need living symbols to find meaning and direction in their lives. Also, unlike the theologians, Jung does not look to the Bible or to Christian tradition for authority or inspiration. Instead, he turns to the psyche, and most particularly to the unconscious. This brings a wholly different dimension into play. To date, Christian theologians have not paid serious attention to the unconscious. A second major misinterpretation, precisely the opposite of the first, is that Jung was anti-Christian and out to destroy Christianity or to supplant it with his own psychological theory, analytical psychology. This is as erroneous as it is to view him as a modern evangelist of Christianity. Jung's attachment to Christianity was indeed profound, and it ran stronger than a mere nod to Swiss conventionality. His commitment became increasingly evident in the latter years of his life. After his taxing journey to India in 1938, at the age of 68, Jung turned almost exclusively in his thinking and writing about religious matters to Western, specifically to Christian, themes. He writes eloquently and with great sensitivity about religious rituals like the Roman Catholic Mass in Transformation Symbolism in the Mass, and about Christian doctrines like the Holy Trinity in a psychological approach to the dogma of the Trinity, both of which I've already, actually, no, I'm about to do Transformation Symbolism in the Mass, and I've already done the second, which is on the Trinity, of which there are two sections that I published. He also dwells deeply on the symbol of Christ and considers the meaning of Christianity for Western culture and humankind in Ion. In answer to Job, he offers a stunning and highly controversial interpretation of the Bible. In all of these late texts, he speaks as a concerned psychologist. While he confesses ignorance of formal theology, he shows great awareness of theological issues and tackles some of the thorniest theological doctrines known to Christendom. These are not attacks on Christian belief and practice, nor do they foresee their demise or suggest their replacement by analytical psychology. Clearly, Christianity meant a great deal to Jung. I believe that in later life it became for him something like an ultimate concern, to use Paul Tillich's phrase for the religious attitude. Christianity's past and future were close to Jung's heart. He advocated the transformation of Christianity. This is significantly different from seeking to revitalize and reform it on the one hand, or from abandoning or destroying it and supplanting it with psychology on the other. Jung's relationship to Christianity was complex, though it is not impenetrable. Was Jung a Christian? This is a question many people have asked. There are many levels to consider in addressing this sensitive issue. If one uses the term Christian in a cultural sense, and not in a more rigorous fashion that requires accepted denominational practices of belief and piety, the answer is yes. Officially, Carl Jung was a Christian by virtue of his baptism, and he died a Christian, his remains being interred in the Swiss Protestant cemetery in the village of Küsnacht, where he lived. In fact, he was steeped in Protestantism. His grandfather, his father, and 6 of his uncles were pastors in the Swiss Reformed Church, and he grew up in a parsonage. He attended church as a child and received communion at the appropriate age. Habits of mind and attitude were importantly shaped by Swiss Protestant Christianity. Even as a youth, however, he showed tendencies toward free thinking, and he could not accept the standard catechism answers to his theological questions. As an adult, he did not attend church services regularly. His intellectual interests in religion ranged all over the map, from the Upanishads to Buddhist teachings, from Christian Taoism to North American Indian nature worship, and he respected them all. With some justice, he's been seen as a harbinger, harbinger? Harbinger? I'm not quite sure how to pronounce it. He's been seen as a harbinger of New Age spirituality, which also blends Eastern and Western and other traditions into numerous individual religious practices and notions. Yet he was highly critical of people who sever themselves from their historical religious roots and try to become practicing members of exotic foreign belief systems. Jung was a cultural conservative, if also a highly adventuresome and far-reaching intellectual explorer. He was a spiritually sensitive man who never left his native Christianity for another religion. In the excerpts from Jung's works that are included in this anthology, one finds the writings of a man who, though untrained formally in Christian theology, is surprisingly steeped in its history. One must keep in mind, however, that theology and church doctrine are not absolutes for Jung. He reckons with them as a psychologist, reading them as statements made by people who were in touch with the symbolic dimension of the psyche and who experienced numinous images of the collective unconscious. He does not regard Christian belief and doctrine or dogma as the definitive words about spiritual reality in any sense. Nor does he understand the biblical account of God as a final and complete revelation. For Jung, individual experience is the ultimate arbiter and final authority in religious matters. There is no high judge. The religious life has, for him, little to do with church and traditional piety, or with following received teachings and established rituals. Its home is in the psychic world of the individual. It is a life that befalls a person unbidden and often unwelcomed. Now move to a section called The Nature of Religious Experience. Jung's most frequent definition of God is the name by which I designate all things which cross my path. The name by which I designate all things which cross my willful path violently and recklessly. All things which upset my subjective views, plans, and intentions, and change the course of my life, for better or worse. It is always the overwhelming psychic factor that is called God. There are many stories in the Bible that suggest this view of God and the religious life. Jung's favorite was the story of Job. Jung does read the Bible as a testament to authentic, original religious experience, but he does not regard it as a privileged document that lies outside the range of comparison and criticism. The scriptures of other religious traditions are similarly rich with authentic accounts of genuine religious experience, and in fact, equally genuine experiences of God could just as well befall people today as they drive to work in comfortable sedans. Visions and revelations of what we call God happen to people in every time and place, and are not limited to one privileged historical epoch. The theologizing based on such contemporary experiences, moreover, is as valid as the words of the apostles about their experiences. The essence of the religious life is, for Jung, religious experience, not piety or correct belief or faithfulness to tradition. To understand specifically what he means by this term, it's helpful to note three paradigmatic instances of it described in his writings. The first of these is an experience from his own childhood. He reports in his autobiography, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, that as a schoolboy in Basel, he had a, quote, religious experience that remained with him for the rest of his life. You ready for this? It happened that one fine summer's day he came out of school and stood in the courtyard in front of the impressive Basel Cathedral. He entertained an image of God sitting on his high throne above the scene before him. The twin towers and checkered tile roof of the cathedral were bathed in brilliant sunlight. It is a massive brick structure, and on that day it seemed to him exceptionally solid and weighty. Jung's maternal grandfather had been the pastor of this fortress of Swiss Reformed Protestantism, and the boy must have felt some pleasure in recognizing a degree of kinship to God Almighty himself. Suddenly, however, he had an unexpected urge to unleash a blasphemous fantasy. Given the majestic sanctity of the mighty cathedral before him and its solemn, somewhat threatening, towering presence, this so frightened him that he ran home and consciously suppressed the fantasy with all his might. For 3 days he struggled against a looming thought that would not be denied. Finally, he could no longer resist it, and with fear and trembling, he let himself return mentally to the scene of the cathedral. Once again, he stood in the courtyard and looked up to the heavens, where Almighty God sat on his golden throne. With a courageous gesture, he released his impertinent mind, and the following sequence of images welled up in him. A trap door opened underneath God's throne, and a gigantic turd fell down and smashed the cathedral to bits. When all was said and done, he did not feel guilty, but rather experienced a rush of relief and grace. A big thought had been released in his mind. Perhaps more remarkable than this fantasy itself is Jung's way of understanding it. For him, this kind of explosive outburst of unexpected, unwelcome, and unconventional mental content, image and thought, became a touchstone for the authenticity of religious experience. The experience of God is the experience of being overwhelmed, terrorized, even humiliated by his awful and contrary will. In religious experience, Jung postulates, one's conscious mind is usurped by a superior inner force and becomes possessed by alien images and thoughts from the unconscious. Responsibility for this, both for the phenomenon of the mind's state of possession and for the unconscious contents that flow into it, belongs to God, that overwhelming psychic factor. It's a quote. God is the force behind the unconscious images that break their way through the ego's defenses and inundate the conscious mind. Jung testifies eloquently to the Protestant sense of the individual's direct, unmediated experience of the divine. It was this kind of foundational experience of God in his own life that allowed Jung to recognize a similar moment in the canonized life of his fellow countryman, Brother Klaus, the patron saint of Switzerland. Blessed Klaus of Flue was a religious figure of the 15th century who apparently was frightened into a life of sanctity by a series of most terrifying visions. In one, he saw, quote, the head of a human figure with a terrifying face, full of wrath and threats, which to him was not commensurate with the orthodox image of the loving God he had been taught about in church. Afterwards, he reported that he had seen, quote, a piercing light resembling a human face. This vision, and presumably others, drove him into a life of seclusion in a tiny hermit's cell within walking distance of his home and considerable family. The frightening, unbidden, unorthodox nature of these images from the unconscious is what most impressed Jung. Brother Klaus eventually rationalized his images into conventional theology and squared them with images of the Trinity. Doing this, Jung felt, in order to preserve his sanity. The life of the religiously gifted is not a comfortable one. The third classic example of religious experience for Jung is biblical. It is the story of Job. Like Jung and Brother Klaus, Job is utterly overcome by the awesome display of God's power. He too is reduced to silence when presented with a vision of God's dreadful might and terrifying magnitude. In Jung's interpretation, Job is completely innocent. He is a scrupulously pious man who follows all the religious conventions, and for most of his life he is blessed with good fortune. This is the expected outcome for a just man in a rationally ordered universe. But then, God goes to work on him, tests him with misfortune, reduces him to misery, and finally overwhelms him with questions and images of divine majesty and power. Job is silenced, and he realizes his inferior position vis-a-vis the Almighty. But he also retains his personal integrity, and this so impresses God that he is forced to take stock of himself. Perhaps he is not so righteous after all. And out of this astonishing self-reflection, induced in God by Job's stubborn righteousness, he, the Almighty, is pushed into a process of transformation that leads eventually to his incarnation in Jesus. God develops empathy and love through his confrontation with Job, and out of it a new relationship between God and humankind is born. This is the kernel of Jung's interpretation of the Book of Job and its position in the Bible. Again, quote, God develops empathy and love through his confrontation with Job, and out of it a new relationship between God and humankind is born. We now get to a section called The Evolution of the God Image. Jung was severely taken to task by many of his theological readers and religious friends, notably by Friar Victor White, for his psychological interpretation of the Book of Job and the Bible. White expressed surprise and consternation that Jung would actually publish such a controversial and heterodox text. He felt such thoughts are better kept to oneself and perhaps shared with a few close confidants. Within the greater context of Jung's life and work as a whole, however, one must acknowledge that his audacious reflections on the Book of Job contribute to his overall program. The fundamental idea behind Answer to Job is that the God image evolves according to basic archetypal patterns, and that the biblical tradition, including Christianity, shows evidence of such developments. While Jung was not a faithful son of the Christian Church, he was profoundly engaged by the dilemma of what he saw in it as an ailing religious tradition. As I've argued at length in my book Jung's Treatment of Christianity, Jung actually diagnosed and set out to treat Christianity, much as he would a patient in his analytical practice. He saw modern Christianity as having entered a cul-de-sac and as being endangered by stagnation and slow death. He wanted to help Christianity get back on the track of its potential internal development. According to Jung's understanding, Christianity was initially born of a historical psychological development within Judaism, which is reflected in the Hebrew Bible. The inner logic in the emergence of Christianity from Judaism has to do with the evolution of the God image, and this process continues to the present time. The God image of a people is not static, it evolves through time. That is to say, the ultimate God image, which is embedded in the collective unconscious, gradually emerges into consciousness over the course of millennia. The historic changes in the God image can be studied in the texts handed down by tradition. Texts like the Bible and the writings of commentators, theologians, the church fathers, and the various heretics, for example, the Gnostics and alchemists. The development of the God image is a result of interplay between the images and definitions presented by tradition and the human protagonists who carry that tradition forward. This dynamic, as demonstrated in the Book of Job and its aftermath in the following centuries, leads to the manifestation of a more complete God image. In this case, an image that is less one-sidedly patriarchal and more inclusive of the feminine. In Christianity, this evolution is still underway. The image is not complete. There is still more to come, and the blocks to its manifestation need to be cleared away. This is a task of psychology. It is this view of doctrine as evolving and the ambition for psychology's part in the theological enterprise that make Jung's work on Christianity so controversial, and for many theologians so completely unacceptable. The religiously gifted, or perhaps cursed would be a better term, given Jung's views on the nature of religious experience, contribute to this ongoing development of the God image. They do this by raising into collective awareness those aspects of the full image that have either been left out of the picture or have never before been revealed. In the time of Job, it was God's love and wisdom, Sophia, that had been lost or repressed in the disappearance of the feminine from the God image in the patriarchal religion of Taoism. This needed to be recalled. This aspect of God came to the fore in the Gospels of the New Testament and in the testimony of Christianity that God is love. In the heterodox visions of Brother Klaus, Jung felt, one sees the emergence of further aspects of the divine, its feminine aspect as God the Mother, and the combination of father and mother as, quote, the androgyny of the divine ground. Through Brother Klaus' visions, this becomes available to consciousness, but in a form so terrifying that it nearly drove the man insane. However, this vision is a contribution to the ongoing transformation and emergence of the full God image. In Jung's own case, we can say it, though Jung would not have been quite so bold as to suggest it himself. His inner experiences, his visions, and his writings based on them portray an image of God that is more whole and complete than the biblical Christian image. Jung's proposed revision of the God image is presented not as a vision, but at the level of theory, the quaternity instead of the Trinity, and conscious reflection made available by psychological terminology and concepts. Experientially, however, the source of it was primitive and at times terrifying. While Jung does not stand within the theological circle so adequately defined and maintained by his Swiss Reformed countrymen, Barth and Brunner, he does make a strong positive contribution to the potential further development of the Christian God image and to the evolution of Christian tradition. I'm going to continue here. So we're now looking at a section called Jung's personal relationship to Christianity. On a personal level, as one can see from the selection of readings introduced in part one of this anthology, Jung did not consider himself to be a committed member of a Christian denomination. He grew up in a parsonage, but his early experience of Swiss Reformed Protestantism left him cold. To him, it seemed a lifeless institution, without either much intellectual honesty or spiritual vitality. While he maintained a correct relation with the Reformed Church throughout his life, being baptized, married, and buried in it, having his children do likewise, etc., he did not seek or find any further spiritual benefits from the source. Yet his mind was occupied with theological questions and problems from early on and until the end of his life. Even as a lad, he questioned his father about such doctrines as the Holy Trinity. And as a medical student in Basel, he took time to read philosophy and theology. Always his critique was that the modern church lacked spiritual depth and intellectual rigor. It has been speculated that Jung's attitude toward the contemporary church and the Christian tradition would have been different had he grown up in another cultural setting, but this is hard to imagine. Perhaps a different parson father would have been a greater positive influence on him. The Swiss Protestant church that Jung confronted was not atypical of mainstream Protestant denominations. Always politically and theologically correct, it had nevertheless lost its savor, and in Jung's view, the Holy Spirit had left for other paths. God is dead, Nietzsche, another denizen of Basel, announced in the late 19th century, and it would take the likes of Karl Barth, writing during World War I on the Book of Romans, to awaken European Protestants from their comfortable or uncomfortable slumbers. The life and work of Karl Barth, only a few years Jung's junior, forms an instructive contrast to Jung's. It demonstrates that someone could grow up in the same cultural and religious milieu and still take a lively interest in the Christian church. Also, the son of a Swiss Reformed clergyman and theologian, Barth entered the theological circle early in life and stayed there. His, too, was a highly creative life, only with a compass turned unwaveringly to the heart of the Christian theological tradition and its source, the Bible. From there, he drew the inspiration that fueled the writing of his massive church dogmatics and anchored him intellectually and spiritually in a time of frightening social and political upheaval in Europe. While Barth began his career with a strong appreciation of religious experience and the personal feeling side of religious life, he became suspicious of their seductions and later rooted himself instead in more objective matters, namely in the Bible and in the received teaching of the church. Interestingly, his emphasis on the utter freedom of God from human control somewhat parallels Jung's view of God as an overwhelming force that does not conform to the ego's plans or notions. God is autonomous and free for both men. But for Barth, the biblical revelation is final and complete. For Jung, ever the psychologist, much of the God image is still unconscious and will be further revealed as time goes on. It would have made for an exciting intellectual event to have had Jung and Barth face one another and discuss matters theological and religious, but sadly this never happened. Both were inspiring and witty public speakers, and both loved the homely metaphors and rough guttural language of their native Swiss culture. There was, however, no contact between them. Even with Brunner, who lived in Zurich and taught at the university, only a stone's throw from Jung's chair at the Federal Polytechnic Institute, there was no communication. Jung complained that Protestant theologians ignored him despite his repeated signals of interest in their subject matter, and in Switzerland at least this was largely true. Unhappily, these giants lived side by side, but did not manage to bridge the abyss between their academic faculties. It now gives a couple of paragraphs about Jung's relation with Victor White, and then goes into what we might consider more relevant sections, such as the question of evil and how Jung interprets Christianity. Okay, Victor White, OP. Jung's efforts at building a bridge between psychology and Christian theology met with better results from another quarter, from Roman Catholic clergy, and perhaps never with more promise than in the case of the Dominican theologian and expert on Thomas Aquinas, Friar Victor White. White had discovered Jung's works in the 1930s and had studied them carefully, with an eye to opening a dialogue between theology and science. He wrote Jung a brief letter of introduction and a birthday greeting upon the occasion of Jung's 70th birthday in the summer of 1945. Jung responded with enthusiasm, seeing in White the possibility for a fruitful collaboration with a first-class theological mind. These were the years in Jung's life, beginning in the later 1930s and extending into the 1950s, when he most energetically and consistently turned his attention to Christian themes. The writings in parts 2 and 3 of this anthology all date from this period. In Victor White, whom he jokingly named his White Raven, Jung thought he had finally found the promise of terra firma, firm ground, in Christian theological territory. White taught dogmatic theology at Blackfriars in Oxford, and from his letters he was obviously enthusiastic about collaborating in a dialogue between psychology and theology. Jung's writings had attracted White because he saw them as offering a firm basis in contemporary psychological work in which to anchor the truth of Christian revelation. In Jung's work, White thought, he had discovered a foothold for theology within the realm of modern science. If a scientist like Jung, working completely outside the theological enterprise, could produce evidence for a God image in the human soul, an imago Dei, would this not lend credibility to the claims of medieval Thomistic theology that there is no contradiction between natural science and divine science theology? White thought that in Jung's discovery of the archetype, he had located the key for a new synthesis, similar to the one St. Thomas had achieved between Aristotelian science and Christian teaching in the 13th century. The level of excitement is palpable in their correspondence, which begins in 1945 and continues vigorously through the decade, and then tapers off in the early 1950s. The two men met for the first time in 1946, when they spent 2 weeks together at Jung's Bollingen retreat house. Here they became personally acquainted in the domestic environment of a primitive stone house on Lake Zurich. The place lacked electricity and running water. Meals were prepared by one or the other of them over an open hearth. White had warned Jung before he arrived that he did not know how to cook, and whatever wood was burned for fuel had to be chopped by hand. Jung loved to sail on the Alpine lake in front of the tower, and many of their theological discussions doubtless took place in his small sailing vessel as the old man adjusted sheet and rudder to suit the shifting winds. For White, this was a far cry from a theological seminar in Oxford. It must have been quite an impressive experience for an introverted person like White, who was not known to engage in small talk or inconsequential chatter, or to laugh a great deal, to find himself in the constant presence of a man as electrifyingly alive as C.G. Jung. Each man has his own agenda, and in the end both were gravely disappointed. White came to despair of ever reaching a fundamental understanding with Jung because, as he said in a letter, they had grown up in such different philosophical climates. White was a Thomist, which entails a conviction that truth can be reached by careful thinking in the light of divine revelation. Jung was a Kantian, which means that the most he could ever hope to arrive at were more or less plausible hypotheses about the nature of reality. While White thought he could achieve certainty, Jung remained skeptical, restlessly exploring, turning things over in his mind this way and that, and endlessly investigating without definitive conclusion. It was a temperamental difference and a philosophical one, but the nub of the problem that brought their cordial relationship to an end was their disagreement about the nature of evil. And now we go on into the question of evil. What White could not have known when he first met Jung was that the 70-year-old man was still in the grip of his creative daemon. It would not let him rest until he died 16 years later. Even people close to him were continually surprised by his new insights and directions. Victor White was in for some shocking surprises. Jung conceived the theory of archetypes after his break with Freud in 1913 and elaborated on it in the 1920s and 1930s. This theory formed the intellectual framework for his discussions of such Christian symbols as the Trinity and Christ, and Christian rituals like the Mass. Jung's published writings gave White reasonable grounds to assume some reliability. He could expect a solid foundation of empirically based scientific observation and a consistent interpretation of psychological reality derived from it. White could see a clear opening for a dialogue in which theology could perhaps add further detail to analytical psychology and lead it toward its logical conclusion. Revelation caps human science on the march to truth, according to Thomist philosophy. Where human knowledge of the unconscious reaches its limit and comes to a halt, revelation might go ahead and complete this picture. Jung would have none of this. What theology offered in its images and teachings, he interpreted as an expression of its one-sidedness and dogmatic partiality. Theology for Jung is a conscious elaboration of psychological experience, which in the end departs significantly from its source, the raw experience of the unconscious, and falls into the trap laid by ego defenses. The result is that theology tends toward the one-sidedness of ego consciousness. It cannot take psychology further. It can only block scientific investigation. In theology, Jung judged, the ego with its rationalizing tendencies takes over and cuts away those aspects of the full God image that do not agree with its presuppositions and needs. The case of Brother Klaus illustrates this beautifully, and the doctrine of evil as the privation of good is a doctrinal example of this same rationalizing tendency. This doctrine turned out to be an intractable barrier that wedged itself between Jung and White and could not be removed. Jung wanted to interpret it psychologically and thereby overcome it. White wanted to accept it and use it as a guide for psychology. It was a landmine that blew up in their faces and destroyed their relationship. The notion that evil can be defined as, quote, the absence of good, the privatio boni, made eminent sense to White and no sense at all to Jung. At first, White thought it was only a problem of logic, which could easily be removed once the terms were defined and understood. But much more is at stake here than mere logic. What this definition rests on is the dogmatic assertion that God is completely known, and known to be wholly good. By definition of the ego, Jung would say, there is no evil in God, and he is in no way responsible for even the slightest trace of evil in the world. Evil comes about, according to this theology, when a being turns away from God. God does not want humans to turn away from him and reject him, but humankind is free to do so. The absence of godness, the absence of goodness, which equals God, created by this willful human refusal, is what constitutes evil. White was a supremely qualified philosopher and a razor-sharp logician, but he could not convince Jung, no dummy either, that God is purely good. Jung was antagonistic toward this intellectual approach. Categories and clear definitions are things of the conscious mind, not of immediate experience, and certainly not of the unconscious. Religious experiences of the kind Jung had in mind do not offer clear pictures of a purely good God. But the notion that God is wholly good and that there is no evil in him is bedrock Christian teaching. And White, an ordained Roman Catholic priest and a convinced Christian theologian, could not possibly depart from this certainty. What evil there is in the world, and Christian doctrine holds that there is plenty of it, due to human sin, is there because God has been rejected. Humans have the freedom to reject God and to live in the darkness of their own creation. But God's plan is always good, and his will invariably is directed toward the light. White thought he could bring Jung around to realizing that analytical psychology and its keystone, the archetype of the self, implied the same thing. White would ask, is it not true that it is the ego that goes off on the tracks and cultivates evil out of its lack of insight and inflation and desire for control, while the self is always aligned with truth, health, wholeness, and positive growth? Does not individuation, a person's lifelong journey toward wholeness and consciousness, imply that the self which guides its trajectory is purely good? Given an affirmative answer to these questions, analytical psychology would be in perfect, if unwitting, agreement with Christian teaching. At this point, Jung, the master and creator of analytical psychology, vigorously shook his head and thundered, "Nein. Evil is as real as good. God is as dark as he or she is light. And the doctrine of evil as the privatio boni, the privation of good, is a convenient rationalization of the ego-dominated Christian theological tradition." Theology does not take the reality of the unconscious seriously into account. In a sense, it is impious. Okay, we now move to a section called Christianity as Interpreted by Analytical Psychology. We're on page 16 of 22. Standing outside the theological circle, Jung interpreted Christian doctrine and practice from the perspective of analytical psychology. Analytical psychology, he held, is based on scientific and clinical observation and on self-critical investigation of the psyche, especially the unconscious. As such, it is permanently open to revision and challenge. It is unlike theological doctrine, which claims immutable veracity and finality. It is not dogmatic. It is a perspective that generates interpretive tools for grasping and exploring the inner world and investigating experiences of the non-rational. From the standpoint of analytical psychology, religious experience is seen as an eruption of the unconscious and an expression of latent psychic structures and dynamics. Theological doctrines and rituals, on the contrary, are products of the ego's understanding and represent largely rationalizations of those experiences. For Jung, the raw data from the unconscious, in the form of dreams, visions, and synchronicities, was a much more reliable guide to truth about the God image than theology could ever be. In the perspective offered by analytical psychology, an entire religious tradition can be considered a gigantic collective psyche. It displays evidence of primary experience of the unconscious, the revelation, the conscious elaboration in its thinking about these experiences, the theology, and various ritualistic recreations of these primary experience of the unconscious, the rites. The declared heresies represent the repressed thoughts and images of this psyche and make up its shadow and its personal unconscious. The dominant institutions and their leaders are its ego. The emphasized doctrines, elaborated as the threat of the unconscious, sorry, the emphasized doctrines, elaborated as absolute dogmas, express its one-sidedness and defensiveness against the threat of the unconscious and against further influence from it, i.e., new revelations. The rites and rituals both reconnect the present worshippers to the original primal experience of the unconscious, in illo tempore, to use Eliade's expression, and also to defend them from the threatening eruption of new contents from the unconscious. Religions protect people from God, ironically, even while they connect people to aspects of God in a safe and contained way. Religions are therefore therapeutic institutions, harbors of safety and comfort in a psychic world filled with all sorts of fearful and often destructive potential. Were people not protected from God by their religious institutions, they would be subject to primary religious experience, with its potential for inducing psychotic-like states of consciousness. While White thought he was talking about God with his theological language, therefore, Jung considered that he was referring to a second-hand experience of the unconscious, plus a whole layer of highly rationalized defensive sentiment covering it, in the form of traditional theology. For Jung, as stated earlier, the experience of God was a fearful onslaught of unwanted, unexpected, and often terrifying mental contents. The human experience of God, however, is not limited to mental and emotional states. There is also synchronicity to consider. The archetype of the self, in analytical psychology, the equivalent of the God term, manifests both mentally and physically, also both individually and collectively. So, world history, with its complexity of mental and material features and its mixture of good and evil, was for Jung also a revelation of the divine. Human history can, of course, be seen as the result of humankind's rejection of God's invitation to grace and wholeness, a product of human sin, short-sightedness, and willfulness. This is the Church's position, but it was not Jung's. Jung read the past 2,000 years of Christian history as a two-phased revelation of the collective psychological structure underlying this historical period. In the first phase, lasting until approximately 1000 CE, there was a strenuous development of the spiritual nature of humankind, in part to separate this period in Western history from the preceding paganism, with its emphasis on physicality and sensual pleasure. In the second phase, extending from 1000 CE through the 20th century, the emphasis reversed, and there was a focused concentration of attention on the natural world, leading to modern science and philosophical materialism. This two-phase movement in Western history is revelatory of a pair of opposites, spirit and matter, within the archetypal structure underlying this period of time. God is that which humans posit when they refer to the ultimate patterning power behind the flux of time and history. God is the ground of being and the creator of order. By studying the evolving order, one may catch a glimpse of the hidden hand guiding its movements. For the ever the empiricist, Jung would cite evidence for God's evil, at least from humankind's point of view, as well as for his goodness. If one considers one side of good, sorry, if one considers one side of God, his goodness, for instance, one must also be prepared to register his other side, his evil. Colloquially, Jung would say that God has two right hands. Sorry, that God has two hands, a right and a left. He blesses and he curses. He gives and he takes away. Look at the story of Job. Jung applied the lesson of Job to collective history and to the experience of individuals. Looked at that way, he concluded, one may love God, but one must fear him. In his argument with Victor White over the doctrine of evil as the privation of good and God as only good, we can see Jung attempting to rectify an imbalance in the Christian conception of God, unfettered by any of the doctrinal limitations placed on theologians by Christian teaching. Jung could consider other religious views as standing on a par with Christian revelation. He felt as much respect for the insights of Taoism and Buddhism and for the teachings of North American native wise men as he did for those of the Bible and the Church Fathers. What he gleaned from them was a God image that represents wholeness in its basic structure and promotes it in its dynamic movements. What he gleaned from them was a God image that represents wholeness in its basic structure and promotes it in its dynamic movements. This image embraces all aspects of reality, which from a human viewpoint, the ego, often divided into polarities, or even split into irreconcilable opposites. The pairs, for example, good and evil, and masculine and feminine, are typical instances of this tendency to split. Human beings, in their effort to understand the world and to cope with its challenges, sort and label many aspects of experienced reality by using the distinguishing features of these polarities. Because of the human propensity toward narcissistic self-centeredness, features of the natural world, such as earthquakes and floods, are called evil, while other features, such as lush landscapes and abundant harvests, are called good. People will thank God for the latter and perhaps curse him for the former. From a larger non-human perspective, these are merely products of natural forces and have nothing to do with human needs or judgment. But people distort reality by splitting and transforming aspects of it. into the bizarre offspring of fantasy. Sorry. But people distort reality by splitting and transform aspects of it into the bizarre offspring of fantasy. The psychologist tries to correct these defensive distortions and to restore a more balanced appraisal of reality based on direct experience and observation, rather than on elaborate mental justifications and rationalizations. To Jung, the doctrine of evil as the privation of good was such a distortion. It is the psychologist's job to interpret distortions and to help patients remove them from consciousness. Of course, White, the theologian, did not see it that way. We're on page 18, to the end of page 18 of 22, and we're moving to a section called Jung's mission. If we ask Jung why he cared about all of this theological business enough to spend so much time and energy on it, we enter into the complex territory of psychological motivation and of unconsciousness as well as conscious intention. And of unconscious as well as unconscious. Sorry, and of unconscious as well as conscious intention. I must be getting tired. One quite evident point that can be gleaned from his writings is that Jung felt a doctor's obligation to help those patients who suffered from the distortions inflicted on them by religious education and upbringing. Every psychotherapist faces the challenge of removing the pathogenic effects of some religious teachings. The doctrine that God is good and that all evil in the world must be assigned to humans can lead in some people to an intolerable emphasis on their own sinfulness. In some sensitive souls, this teaching works in tandem with tendencies toward obsessive thinking and compulsive behavior. The problem of scruples and extreme neurotic exaggeration of one's own sinfulness is well known in Christian religious life. A person's entire life can become heavily shrouded in the guilt generated by normal human desires for pleasure, sexuality being one of the most common of these. So, one of Jung's motivations in addressing a theological doctrine like the privation of good, the privatio boni, was to rectify the balance of responsibility. Not only humans, but God too is responsible for evil in the world. God made me do it, if offered as a defense for an immoral thought like the destruction of the Basel Cathedral, would have to be taken seriously in the inner judgment halls of one's own conscience. Beyond his concern for such patients, however, I believe Jung felt a therapeutic responsibility toward the Christian tradition as a whole, as though it were an ailing patient in need of therapy. The ailments are complex. There is the splitting, spirit versus body, good versus evil, masculine versus feminine. And there is the repression of the second of each of these pairs from the dominant center of consciousness, the prevailing God image. That's the body, evil, and the feminine. This has led to a historical moment of crisis in which the Christian tradition must transform itself or enter into a long and painful dying process. Indeed, it's also a world crisis. In our time, Christianity has little to contribute to culture because it is out of touch with the unconscious and the zeitgeist. The only solution is to undertake a transformation process, like that of individuals who enter therapy and rediscover themselves in depth. Out of this engagement with the unconscious comes the impetus for new life, based on a transformed inner world and a new sense of identity. i.e., this is me, by participating in a perspective which is beyond those splits. By participating in a perspective which is beyond those splits. Again, the only solution is to undertake a transformation process like that of individuals who enter therapy and rediscover themselves in depth. Out of this engagement with the unconscious comes the impetus for new life, based on a transformed inner world and a new sense of identity. The self-image of Christianity must become more inclusive and more capable of embracing wholeness. This is the fundamental problem of traditional Christianity. The old bottles cannot adequately contain the new wine of the Spirit. And I added, hence it spills over in Dionysian revelry. I also had a little upside down triangle with Christ and Lucifer and Ion, but I won't go into that right here. Let's move on. In a letter to Victor White, Jung gives the following advice to the priest, who at the time was suffering a perceived injustice at the hands of his superiors. Quote, "It depends very much indeed upon the way you envisage your position with reference to the church. I should advocate an analytical attitude, which is permissible as well as honest, vis-a-vis, take the church as your ailing employer and your colleagues as the unconscious inmates of a hospital." Here, Jung is suggesting to White more or less what he himself adopted vis-a-vis the Christian tradition, an attitude of doctor to ailing patients. Jung recognized in the historical picture of Christianity features held in common with his suffering psychiatric patients. There was a history of repression of incompatible tendencies, the heresies such as Gnosticism and alchemy, the concomitant development of one-sided structures in consciousness, the accepted doctrines and practices, the psychic death through loss of meaning and energy in middle and old age, the contemporary churches in Europe, and a crisis that could not be met because the living connection to the unconscious had been lost. It was this situation that Jung attempted to address in his writings on Christian doctrine, image, and ritual in the last 30 years of his life. Now on page 20 of 22, and we move to a section called Jung's Method, and then the value of Jung's writings for Christianity. Not included in this anthology are Jung's writings on clinical themes and methods, which are needed to understand fully my argument here. In the treatment of patients, Jung advocates becoming psychologically involved with them by allowing oneself to become affected emotionally by their suffering. The doctor deliberately becomes infected with their illnesses in order to feel what they're feeling. This is the basis of empathy, and it sets up a resonance between doctor and patient. This is not the way that I would describe or approach a description of Jungian methodology, but in any case, it's presented much more fully in Modern Man in Search of a Soul and many other places. When this happens, the doctor is able to diagnose and treat the patient from within, so to speak. By going inward, he or she is also going outward to the other. And what the doctor discovers by going inward into his or her own unconscious has an application to the patient. The healing comes about bilaterally. The physician heals him or herself, and the patient is cured with the medicine derived from this process. This method of treatment is an entirely different model of healing from the detached, white-coated surgical medical practices of Western societies. Jung's therapeutic approach to Christianity is of this type. By going into himself, observing his own dreams, following his unconsciously determined impulses and intuition, he came upon themes and images and ideas that may be useful to Christianity. He cured himself of Christianity's illness, and the writings contained in this anthology represent the healing medicine he found in his inner process. Answer to Job is a prime example of this method at work. It was the only of his works that he said that he would not rewrite. Jung wrote it in a feverish burst of passion over 2 weeks while recovering from an illness in the years following World War II. Many of the ideas in this work, of course, had been incubating in him for many years prior to the writing. Nevertheless, the text itself was composed under the direction of his passionate personal engagement with physical suffering, old age depression, and grave doubts about God's goodness in the grim aftermath of the European collapse of culture and values during the evil years of war and Holocaust. All of this could be found mirrored in the Christianity of the day. Similarly, his book Ion, a study of Christian history in the age of Pisces, grew out of dreams and a surprising inner urge to write about the Christ symbol. These literary productions represent the response of his consciousness to the ailing religious and cultural environment in which he was living at the time. By publishing these reflections and putting the weight of his considerable scientific and medical reputation behind them, Jung was attempting to treat the patient, Christian tradition and culture, as well as himself. In doing so, he took the considerable risk of diminishing his own personal standing in the scientific world. In fact, he was severely criticized by theologians and ignored by scientists, who most probably considered these as the ramblings of an old man in his dotage. Only a few people saw much value in these works. What can we say today about the value of Jung's writings on Christianity? Certainly they are a unique combination. Certainly they are a unique contribution to Christian thought and practice. For those who live within the confines of the Christian theological circle, they are probably still beyond the pale. Jung's views on the further evolution of Christian doctrine will not be shared by many, if any at all, conventional theologians. To conceive of God as quaternity rather than trinity integrates evil and the feminine into the divine structure and creates a more balanced symbol of wholeness and totality. What Jung does is open a way to transform. What Jung does is open a way to transformation of the God image, and also to the synthesis of Eastern and Western religious thought at a profound level through a more inclusive symbol of the Godhead. The implications of this transformation include a perception of God as a male-female and a light-dark unity, a symbol of wholeness. Practically, Jung advocates inclusion of dreams, visions, and individual religious experience as essential features of an ongoing revelatory process of the divine. Dreams are to be put on a par with the biblical testimony, the witness of heretics, and the accepted doctrinal pronouncements of the past. The divine reality is not to be set apart from the human, but rather seen as participant in a common process of evolution and an ongoing development of consciousness. The image of God is never to be seen as final and complete, and humans are creators of new dimensions of meaning and understanding. Jung's writings propose a process theology of a psychologically attuned type. Jung was not naive enough to believe that Christianity would be ready for his therapeutic ministrations anytime soon. He had his eye on the distant future. His confidence is placed more in the unconscious process of collective evolution and development than in the notion that intelligent people might eventually discover them and find them useful. He felt that his writings, which emerged from his own depths, in which he actually served, rather than controlled or dictated, would be of value to people in the future. Time is on his side. The transformation of the God image is underway, and Jung saw himself simply as its servant and spokesperson, using the limited means at his command to advance a process that will unfold over the coming millennium. It is impossible to predict accurately how Christian doctrine and practice will change in the coming centuries. Jung would not have been among those to wish for or to imagine Christianity's further deterioration or demise. Its transformation, however, is inevitable. As non-Europeans more and more constitute the majority in all Christian denominations, their cultural and social diversity is bound to have a powerful effect. And as other major religious traditions become more familiar and are accepted as existing on a par with Christian views and conceptions, there is bound to be mutual integration and deep internal influence. Should intelligent life be discovered elsewhere in the universe, as seems highly likely today, there will be an added urgency to engage in comparison and exchange of views about spiritual realities. In all of these discussions, Jung's conception of a deep archetypal background to conscious human thought, experience, and perception can be, and for some certainly will be, a useful tool for orientation and understanding. Murray Stein. The quote from the beginning. The arcane substance of alchemy corresponds to the Christian dominant, which was originally alive and present in consciousness, but then sank into the unconscious, and must now be restored in renewed form.